Oftentimes, we can think of homeschooling as mom's gig, which is really unfortunate. It is so important for dad to be on board and for both husband and wife to have a shared vision for their children's education. In this episode, we're talking about a dad's role in homeschooling. You're listening to the Homeschool Made Simple podcast. This is a podcast to help you homeschool simply, inexpensively, and enjoyably. Carol Joy Seid has been helping families homeschool for several decades now, and her son JJ Seid is a pastor and dad of 4 children who he and his wife Kristen homeschool. We hope this conversation encourages you as husband and wife to partner together in homeschooling. Listen in.
I'm just going to kind of be throwing some thoughts and, just questions and things to JJ about why is it so important for the dad to be on board with homeschooling, and what is the role of the father? Because I think so often we think of homeschool as a mom's gig, and that to me is really unfortunate.
Yeah, everything we do as a couple, we do together, whether we realize it or not. True. So it's probably good for us to remind each other of that so that we can be unified and do it in a way that serves each other and serves our kids. Yes.
So off air, we were talking a little bit about the idea of the calling, that this is a supernatural call to do something hard. And why is it so important for you as a dad to really carry that mantle of leadership in this area when things get rough?
Everybody's always speculating about whether this generation is softer than the one that came before, and that could be such a rabbit trail. I think every generation in America has faced its own challenges. But something that's probably universal for all parents is when something gets hard, it's really important to know whether or not you should stay the course, or it being hard is somehow a sign that you've taken a wrong turning. If you exit onto a side road and all of a sudden you realize you're not on gravel anymore and you're driving over potholes, and then all of a sudden there's no road and you're in a pasture, you might have gotten lost and you might be about to drive into a pond. But as a couple, if you pray and do your research and talk with people you trust who are older and have lived more life, and then you make a decision together as a couple to, for instance, homeschool, and then confusingly, in some ways, life gets harder, it's really important to be able to stop and say, okay, we prayed about this, we sought wise counsel for the unique situations that our children are facing, some convictions that we agree on. We still think this is what we should do in the season. So just because it got hard doesn't mean that we got off track. There may be an invitation for us to persevere and to seek additional wise counsel and to remind ourselves that it won't always be this hard. But yeah, I think you're right. The word calling is helpful, not to hint that homeschooling is inherently more spiritual, but to remind ourselves to stay the course on things we agreed on together in prayer and conversation. And that just because something's gotten hard doesn't mean it's wrong. It may just be an invitation to make some sacrifices for something we believe in. Pay now or pay later. So that's for sure. There's some ways in which we invest in the care of our kids that feel like death now, but can lead to life later. And we have to remind ourselves that we're doing things that we believe in, even on the days when we're really tired.
Yes. And as a dad, do you feel like you are giving your bride that encouragement because she's so in the trenches with those kids, and you walk in the door, and can you bring some fresh air into her vision when she's just hanging by a thread?
Yeah, I think a lot of homeschool dads, and this is true for me as well, can feel guilty. You feel hopeless because you're at work so many hours of the week. You actually spend the majority of your waking hours at work. If you're in a traditional setup like mine, a single income family, which is a privilege. I know not every family can afford that these days. But you still then carry a measure of guilt because you know how much your wife is carrying, and you wish that you could be there at times of the week when you can't. But you're absolutely right. The way you walk in the door probably does matter a great deal. We need to be thanking our wives regularly. We need to be considering how we can lighten her load. That might mean walking in the door and being willing to prepare dinner because she's had such a long day. It might mean being sensitive to those times of the year when she panics and realizes she hasn't planned for the upcoming semester. And that can make you want to quit homeschooling. You're like, I don't have a plan. I don't know what we're doing. Maybe we just need to hit eject. And a lot of times it's a time for the husband to be supportive and ask his wife, what would feel helpful? We've had those seasons. Do you need a Saturday where you can spread everything out on the kitchen table and I take the kids to the zoo where the house is quiet, but you've got all your books at hand and you can just think and maybe find a few used books on Amazon or some half-price books website and track down all your materials for the semester, figure out what you're going to do because you're always interrupted and you never have silence. So sometimes it's that simple. Instead of us feeling a bunch of false guilt and feeling hopeless because we can't be there, there's small things we can do to show our wife that we're in the trenches with them and we're willing to give them the support they need to sit down and think, plan ahead.
Yeah, and talk about being the power behind the badge. Sometimes when I'm consulting with couples, I'm hearing that the children are very disrespectful to the mom during the day. But when dad walks in, they're like, oh, hi. And talk a little bit about the conversations that need to be had with children, whether you're in the building at the time or not, and how that empowers Kristen.
Yeah, the name of the author is escaping me. There's a book called The Masculine Mandate by a great former tank commander who was saved later in life and became a Presbyterian pastor. It's a great book. I'll have to look up.
Say the title
again. The Masculine Mandate. But he talks about that idea, that it would be inappropriate to describe the dad as the bad cop. That's a caricature.
Right.
We would never want to advocate harshness for fathers. But there is something to be said about your wife feeling protected by you or backstopped by you. Familiarity can breed contempt when kids are home all day with mom, sort of chipping away at her authority and constantly poking at her. It can become exhausting, and that familiarity can cause them to behave at less than their best. So there is something to be said about dad coming home and quietly asking, is that how you talk to your mom when I'm not here? And all of a sudden your kid's looking at you going like, I think there's a right answer to this question. So it's good that dads would gently remind their kids that there's a very high standard for how mom is addressed, how she's obeyed, how quickly she's obeyed, how she's treated with gratitude, the sacrifice that she's making by homeschooling when she could frankly be devoting her time to many other things. And she's setting those things aside in order to give of herself in this way. And so from her kids, she deserves gratitude, kindness, prompt obedience. And, they're humans just like their parents. And so they forget. And so, I think dads hold the line gently but firmly. They remind their kids and they treat, hopefully, their wives with respect and speak to their wives in such a way that it models for their kids how mom should be treated, spoken to, and respected. And it does seem like as dads, we have to come home and from time to time recalibrate that baseline.
That's so good.
We get sloppy as a family, and mom gets increasingly mistreated. And treated with ingratitude. And it is probably, doing podcasts is horrible because all you're doing is indicting yourself as an imperfect parent. But my hope is that all of us dads can hopefully be asking ourselves, am I helping my children to treat my wife with the respect and the dignity and the gratitude that she deserves?
So good. So good. Sometimes when I'm consulting with a couple, I'll say to the dad, I need you to take your son out for a walk or ice cream or whatever and say, Mommy is the most precious thing in our house. And if you dishonor her, you are dishonoring my bride and you will wish you were never born. Like there needs to be a major understanding that what you do to mommy, you're doing to me as a dad. And they need to see that because moms are more tender. They're, God's made them that way. But like you said, the children wear them down.
Yeah, men and women have all different personality types, but there are some things that seem to be resident in gendered identity by God. And I think nurture is a pretty safe domain to name as something that God has uniquely gifted women to do, carrying a human life in their body. giving birth to that life, sustaining it, having a sense of preservation and protection over that child. And so forcing that person who's maximally gifted in those areas to also turn around and police how their nurture is received can make a mother feel like she's having to be a mother and a father at the same time.
That's right.
So it is helpful for fathers to use masculine strength to remind their children how precious it is to have a mother and how a mother should be treated.
Amen. Well put. Okay, there's 3 roles that I really want to talk about in terms of dads. One is dad as a reader. How do you walk that out, and how would you encourage other dads?
Yeah, our particular approach to homeschooling is what we call a literature-based approach. And that means that books can't just be a theoretical part of your life. They have to be a concrete, functional, ongoing part of your home. And that starts with dad. Dad is very interesting when he walks in the door because he hasn't been around.
That's right.
Dad is somebody that people look to for what's appropriate or not appropriate. My friends and I, in times where we've fallen off the health bandwagon and our kids find a candy bar on our side table, they think that's the juiciest piece of news ever, right? Because they're paying close attention to how dad eats because that dictates in their minds how they can. Well, dad had a candy bar. I saw it in the glove box of his car. So dad's reading is really significant. As dads, if we're trying to champion a literature-based approach to education, but our kids never see us reading, if they always see us disappearing into screens in our exhaustion, never picking up a book, never reading for pleasure, it'll at the least communicate an inconsistent message. And we all have seasons where we ebb and flow in our reading habits. But the hope would be that we are pace setters in our home where they don't see reading as something that only mom does, but that it's something dad enjoys. It's something he values. It's something he doesn't just do to cram for a meeting, but also something he does for pleasure. And that's infectious. Kids are going to be interested in what their dad is interested in as a rule.
Yes.
And so dad needs to model being a reader. And of course we talk a lot about reading aloud, but it does start with the kids realizing that dad enjoys books, is interested in books. Books are a valuable part of his life.
We hope you'll join us for one of our 2025 seminars. JJ and I will teach you how to create a rich family culture that holistically educates your kids. You'll learn about living with your children in an understanding way, including work and service in their education, building your curriculum around history, and cultivating a love of reading that will grow lifelong learners. Families tell us these seminars feel like a breath of fresh air. It's a great time for both parents to get on the same page about homeschooling. Visit our website at homeschoolmadesimple.net/seminars. We can't wait to see you in 2025. I think Spurgeon it was who said, "Show me a man's bank book and I'll show you his heart." Of course, paraphrasing Jesus, where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. So a dad buys books. He buys books for his children. When he goes on business trips, he doesn't buy T-shirts at the airport store, but he takes that money and wisely buys an investment book that they've all been coveting and dreaming about. You're modeling, you buy books for yourself, but you also buy books for your children because books are what you value.
Yeah, and I'm addicted to books, so I can't really put it in the category of virtue.
Right.
For me, it's more of a vice. But if it's a vice that can be turned into a virtue, then I guess that's a good thing. But I know that for a lot of guys, these are new habits that they're learning, and they're new muscles that they're exercising, and that's okay. I don't think any of us need to feel self-conscious about that. But we can take small steps, especially in the same way that we would come alongside one of our sons who's struggling to be interested in reading. We can stop and ask ourselves, what are things that we're interested in and naturally passionate about? And then go find books about those subjects. And we'll discover alongside of our sons that reading can actually be not only painless, but pleasurable. Start with what you know and what you like and go from there. So I think many men sometimes feel like novices when it comes to reading, but I think most of us have more of an interest and a capacity for it than we realize.
Yeah.
If we'll start with things that we already enjoy.
So as a young man, I remember you were reading some biographies that really impacted you. I don't remember the name, like a basketball player that really you like?
Yes. I mean, because I was playing basketball 7 days a week, when I discovered the basketball section of our local public library, I knew what Dewey Decimal Number all those books were filed under in the nonfiction section. And I would just go and scour it,
And they were biographies.
Right. I stumbled across, a book called Foul, the Connie Hawkins story.
That's it.
That's what you're thinking
I
of?
remember you just loving that book.
Yeah, Connie Hawkins was one of the great sort of forgotten basketball players of the last 100 years. Wearing shoes 2 sizes too small and languishing in the ABA. It took him a long time to make it to the NBA. Getting caught up in the point shaving scandal in college basketball at the time, and probably getting unfairly blamed. His story was in many ways tragic. So I would read that book over and over again, or Rick Tielander's book, Heaven is a Playground, which I think President Obama said was the greatest basketball book he'd ever read. So when I was stumbling across these books, they were all incredible. They're books that have stood the test of time. So
Pistol Pete.
I've read multiple biographies on Pistol Pete. I read his autobiography. So something that I was doing 7 days a week.
Right.
That people might not consider that to be elite or highly intellectual.
Classical literature.
That's right. But I wouldn't look down my nose at any of that. Those are wonderful memories. I learned a lot about culture, sociology,
and character.
American history, overcoming adversity. We could sit and talk about virtue ethics as it relates to the basketball section of the nonfiction area of the library.
Yeah.
But there's something really beautiful about reading things that interest you and not getting too fussy about that. Alan Jacobs, professor at Baylor, head of the Great Books program there, former professor of mine at Wheaton, has written a great book called The Pleasures of Reading in an Age of Distraction. And in that book, he says, my rule is to follow the rule of whim. Read what you like. And of course, people are saying, oh, come on, Jacobs. You've read the Iliad and the Odyssey and Plato's Republic, and there's no way you're just following your whim, that you read things like that for pleasure. And Jacobs' point is, if you'll start with the things that interest you and sort of build your reading muscles, then you can slowly begin to incorporate in books that do require a little more discipline, but actually are a lot more fun than if you tried to start with Plato's Republic.
That's right.
So it really is true that you should read what interests you and fall in love with reading first, and then you can worry about the Western canon later.
Definitely. So talk about the high point of the day, which is daddy reading at night. If you work a traditional schedule, some men are, work nights and then they're reading at breakfast or whatever. But daddy reading, to me, that's like the high point of any homeschool family's day. If it's at all possible for dad to do that. Talk about that.
Well, yeah. What would you like me to say? What are you thinking of?
Well, I don't really have any agenda here. I've watched you and your family. You've got a pretty big age span.
Yes.
So, Brinker gets, picture books. He's very demanding. He doesn't want to listen to long books. He complains if we read long books.
Right.
So then he goes to bed.
Yeah.
Then you read your twins, and they have voracious appetites for long, descriptive, like I'm reading Little Britches to them now. We just finished Dirk's Dog Bellow. Like they will sit through anything and hang on every word. But then Isley has a very different opinion and taste, and then you read to her separately, which is an all-night affair, what I've just described here. It's a long day.
We've probably made every mistake in the book and then tried to circle the wagons back.
Yeah.
Based on those comments, I guess a couple things I'd say are, we're currently reading aloud A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle. So that's really exciting because that was a trilogy. The first 3 books that she wrote in that trilogy are just incredible. And I read those over and over as a child. So it feels really meaningful to now get to read them to my kids for the first time. Isley has already read them over and over and over. She's 14. But for the 9-year-old boys, I felt like they were finally old enough to be able to apprehend and appreciate those books. They have some mature themes, and there's some scary bits. So I think that also helped to have them be a little bit older. Brinker is 6. And it's out of his wheelhouse, and he's annoyed about it. And so, sometimes to quote a famous deceased Jewish therapist, Edwin Friedman, who famously wrote about anxiety and family systems, Friedman would say that as a leader, your job is to be the strength in the system, And so I've realized that almost like a surge protector, our job as parents is to pick great books, to trust our own judgment, and to ride out the anxiety and the criticism, because our kids will try to shout down certain book choices. And then 3 chapters in, they're begging me to read another chapter.
That's right.
That's right. I really shouldn't, but because I'm human, I have to pause and go, oh, you want me to read another chapter of this book that you begged me not to read? Yes, Dad. So, there are reminders that it's not like we're trying to shove things down our kids' throats.
Right.
But a book is like a new relationship in some ways, and so there is the awkward first conversation by analogy and getting to know the book.
Yeah.
And then if you stick with it long enough, if it's a great book, you're going to be hooked and your
right.
kids are going to be begging to read another chapter. But yes, there are moments where the 6-year-old tries to foment an insurrection. So currently what we've done, this is a snapshot of all of our failures and successes, trying to find a book that would unite the clans. That's not easy to do.
No.
And so Isley did a great job of saying, I think we should read A Wrinkle in Time. So in that sense, we had her buy-in because it was one of her favorites and she was in the mood to have it reread to her. Mm-hmm. So that helped. Yeah. Then I knew that the twins would buy in because they're the right age for it. And then Brinker's just going to have to just deal with it.
Yeah.
But he gets to cuddle and play with something, a fidget toy or color.
Yeah.
Some of them are coloring now while we're reading at bedtime.
Yeah.
And then as a compromise, when we finish reading the chapter Wrinkle in Time, Kristen will tuck him into bed and read him a picture book.
Yes.
So he gets his consolation prize after we read as a family. Yes. So that's sort of how we've navigated 6 to 14, which feels like a big stretch.
Right.
And all 4 of them have strong opinions.
Yes. Their side.
Yeah, none of them are sort of go-along kids. They're all... I remember, I won't out him by name, but I remember sitting years ago with an elder in the church I served in who had 2 adult daughters who were rather compliant and said to me very smugly that the idea of a strong-willed child is just a myth. Yeah. And I didn't say anything, but I silently thought to myself, well, that's just because you've never had one.
That's right.
But I have 4, so I know it's not a myth. But so figuring out how to get everybody around the table. Sometimes we read over dinner when it took too long to prepare dinner, or we came back from an event and we're eating late.
Yes.
So we'll the kids are really anxious that we don't miss reading a chapter of Wrinkle in Time. So as a compromise, I'll eat quickly, which I do anyway because I have bad table manners. And then I can read while they eat, which also helps the kids focus and eat better.
Yes.
So we've come up with little compromises. Sometimes I've read aloud to them in the minivan while Kristen is driving us somewhere.
Yes.
Which also helps when kids can be cranky in the car. So we've learned to incorporate reading into different rhythms of our life and to make compromises with our schedule. But what's cool is if you do it enough to create an appetite and an expectation for it in your kids, even kids that you would never expect to have that appetite, if you persist over time, kids who seem to be more interested in video games than books will begin to gain an appetite for being read to.
True.
And will begin begging for it in ways that will surprise you. And then it's sort of like a flywheel. It takes a lot of energy to get it spun up, but once it gets going, it doesn't take much energy to maintain that momentum.
Yes.
And so it's fun to have your kids going, are we going to get to read tonight? I hope we get to read tonight. And you'll think back to say, man, 6 months ago or a year ago, I never would have imagined when we started unplugging as a family that they would be begging me to read to them. But kids really will get the bug.
Yes.
If you stay the course and if you pick good books.
And if you show that leadership, like you talked about in the beginning.
Yes. Be the strength in the system.
That's right.
Yeah. We don't have to be a jerk about it, but we can be confident in our decision making.
Yeah.
And we can keep doing it until they get the hang of it.
So good, JJ. I have to just give a little disclaimer because we will get letters. The book you mentioned, Madeline L'Engle was a wonderful writer, but a terrible theologian.
Yeah, there's universalist themes in that first book. I just came to one of those paragraphs, but that's the beauty of reading aloud. I just edited on the fly. Because Isley's read the book 10 times, she caught that I had skipped a section. And she discreetly asked me about it later that night. And so it was a great opportunity to talk with a thoughtful teenager about how much we love Madeline L'Engle, how much of those books ring true. And yet she was sort of lumping in Jesus with Gandhi and Churchill, in a paragraph, and in a way that I find insufferable. And Buddha. And so I just explained it. Well, she'd also threw inventors in there. It was a very bizarre paragraph.
Yeah.
But I understand, and I just said to Isley, I hope L'Engle wasn't pandering, because that's the kind of paragraph that'll get you a lot of praise in certain circles. Yeah. I hope she wrote that paragraph because she really believed it. At least that would be authentic. But it was sort of tired and warmed over, sort of
Universalism.
Universalism and theological liberalism of 100 years ago.
Exactly.
So, but I'm not threatened by that. We're constantly exposing our kids to truth. And so for Isley to read that on her own doesn't bother me. She can ask me questions. But I told her that for the 9-year-olds, for the 9-year-olds and the 6-year-olds, I chose to not read that paragraph because I don't think they're old enough to have to wrestle with what Langel's doing there. Whereas I wasn't afraid of Isley doing that when she was older.
Yeah. The book that you read with Isley when before bed, help me to remember that.
It's a really long title. Rebecca McLaughlin is a great Christian apologist, Oxford educated, PhD in Renaissance literature, I believe. Has become one of our premier apologists. She wrote a book called Confronting Christianity, which won Christianity Today's Beautiful Orthodoxy Book of the Year in 2019. And then she went on to write a version for teenagers called 10 Questions Every Teen Should Ask and Answer About Christianity, I believe.
Yeah.
And so Isley and I, published by Crossway, Isley and I read that aloud together. I failed a lot as a dad, but that was one thing that I'm glad we did. And I think it was meaningful. Yeah. We got to have open and honest conversations about a lot of really tough and overwhelming topics. And I got to have a premier apologist at my elbow helping me to have those conversations. So if we're catechizing our kids, we don't need to be afraid of ideas. As long as the truth is also given a fair hearing.
Yes.
You've been listening to the Homeschool Made Simple podcast. If you like what you heard in this episode, please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcast or Spotify, or share this episode with a friend. It means so much when you help us spread the message of Homeschool Made Simple with others. Thanks for joining us this week on the Homeschool Made Simple podcast. Remember, Jesus' commandments are not burdensome. What he calls you to do, he will enable you to do. Blessings.